The telescope that Galileo used is called a refraction telescope, and this is one of the earlier ones. Galileo didn't invent the telescope. This is Galileo's genius. You ready? He just took the glasses that they had developed for looking at ships, and he turned it toward the sky and used it. He did, make it stronger in terms of its magnification, but he didn't invent the telescope. This is a telescope owned by the astronomer Johannes Kepler. It's his personal telescope. It's a series of lenses inside the tube, and as the light passes through the lenses, it amplifies it, magnifies it. This is one of Johannes Kepler's workbooks here. It's been published, and he's written in the margins of his own book as he reviews it. And what's interesting, when you look at this marginalia here, what they discover many times is it's not science. It's actually prayers. Kepler would write prayers in the margins of his scientific works. One of his famous statements was, "I thank you, God, that you allow me to think your thoughts after you." And so when you ask, what is the birth of science? Where did science get its start? It's not a secular endeavor. It began in a very clear Christian theistic context. The founding fathers of modern science were all very strong Christians, and so was Kepler. And Kepler gives an insight into how they could begin to do science. They believed that God would allow man to think his thoughts after him. And that's what science is all about. So keep that in mind, because it's very common today to want to try to prove that science, the beginning of science, was a secular thing, and it wasn't. As a matter of fact, some would even say that it would be impossible for science to arise out of a secular context, because you have to assume that man can discover it. And that would take the concept that the mind is strong enough to be able to comprehend the world around. And the Bible teaches that God is a God of order, and that God has created man in his image. And you begin to put those things together and you have science. There's laws in nature because God is a God of order, and man can understand those laws because he's created in God's image. And if we're created in God's image, it's quite likely that at some level we could comprehend what God does. Don't discount that, because many of the other philosophies of the earth would not allow that to happen. It's only within Christian theism that you see that. This is another type of telescope. It's called a reflection telescope. First is refraction. This is reflection. It works on a different principle. In a reflection telescope, at the very back here, there's a curved mirror. And as light passes into the telescope, it hits that curved mirror, which captures it, magnifies it, and then it reflects it to another mirror here, which comes through the eyepiece. Reflection telescopes are not as powerful as refraction telescopes. However, they can gather more light and they create a sharper image. So even though the image may be smaller, you can see more detail in it. And this is a telescope that was designed by an astronomer, Sir Isaac Newton. Developed and invented the reflection telescope, and these are his schematic drawings that he published. Newton was also a very strong Christian, Isaac Newton. After Newton died, they were going through his library and they discovered manuscript after manuscript that he had written on theology. They estimate now he wrote over 1 million words on theology, which is more than he wrote on science. And so he was a Christian theist. However, let me hasten to add that he was also Arian. We know a lot about his theology, especially his Christology, because he wrote so much. And he was an Arian, which means he believed that Christ was God, but he was created by God the Father at some point. He wasn't co-eternal with the Father. So I want you to know that in case you bring up the fact that Newton was a Christian, then the skeptic who knows will say, yeah, but he was a heretic. And yes, we would consider him a heretic Christian in terms of orthodoxy, because he believed that Christ was a created being. But he was a theologian, and he wrote a lot on theology. So light telescopes are the first types of telescopes that were invented. They captured visible light either by modifying it through a series of lenses or having it collected by a curved mirror. And there are light telescopes around the world. Here's an example of some of the different light telescopes. However, there are other types of telescopes that exist that capture parts of the electromagnetic spectrum beyond the visible part or the light part. Let me see if I can describe this without a visual. The theory of light is that, and it's just a theory, we don't know for sure what light is, but the theory is that it is a blending or a mixture of an electrical field and a magnetic field. You know what electricity is, right? You know what magnetism is. Well, they're force fields. And they believe that when those two types of fields overlap, cross, magnetism and electricity, that they can actually create a third phenomenon called electromagnetism. And that electromagnetism is what produces light. I say light because we describe light as what we can see, what we can detect with our human bodies. But scientists now believe that there's much more of that type of phenomenon, light-type phenomenon that extends beyond what we can detect, and that's called electromagnetic energy. So for instance, dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear, right? That's the reason they start yelping whenever there's an ambulance or something coming by, because they're actually hearing a sound that's such a high frequency, our ears cannot detect it. Well, scientists believe that's the same way with light. That whenever we see light, whether it's coming off this board or whether it's coming through these windows from the projector, when you see light coming from any direction, you are only seeing a tiny, tiny window or fraction of a much larger phenomenon called electromagnetic energy. And it goes from high energy to low energy, or from high wavelengths to low wavelengths. And so they envision electromagnetism as a wave, like waves in the ocean. So during a storm you can have very high waves, right, that are breaking, and other times you have very long wavelengths that are low energy. And so each of those different wavelengths can be seen as a different type of electromagnetic phenomenon. Can you name some of them for me? You've heard of them. I know you've heard of them. Like ultraviolet? Ultraviolet is one. Ultraviolet is just light. It's just beyond the violet end of what we can see. The different wavelengths of light within the visible spectrum are what we call colors, like the rainbow. So if you ask what is a different color of light, it's just a different wavelength of light, but it's within the visible portion, so we can see colors. And so you go from red to orange to green to blue to violet, and then you have ultraviolet. It was really big back in the 70s. I used to have an ultraviolet light. Maybe you do too. It's called a black light. So you turn it on, the room's still dark, right? You turn on your black light, the room's still dark, but things begin to glow, right? Because there are certain things, such as your blue jeans or whatever, that actually, when the ultraviolet hits it, it converts it from ultraviolet to light you can see. So it glows. That's pretty cool, especially if you're high. Which I never was, but that's what they told me. No, I never got high. I did burn some incense once, though. Because it was the 70s, right? The 60s, 70s, burned some incense. So what are some more electromagnetic energies? Ultraviolet? Something has to do with red, that'd be the other end, right? Violet at one end, red at the other end. Infrared. It's also electromagnetic energy. At the other end, it's beyond the red end, which is higher energy. Here they are. X-rays, same as light. Gamma rays, heard of gamma rays? Same as light. How about this? Radio. Yes. And TV. TV band, radio band. It's all light. It's just stretched out light. Stretched out light, radio, TV bands. Compressed light, X-rays, gamma rays. It goes from high energy gamma rays, a little bit lower X-rays, then infrared, then through the color spectrum of the visible portion, then ultraviolet, and then TV band, radio band, AM, FM, and so on. It's all the same phenomenon, and it all moves at the same speed, the speed of light, in a vacuum, 186,000 miles per second. And so, we can develop telescopes with giant glass lenses that can magnify the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. But we also can develop telescopes that can capture the other portions too. And they generally appear like this, like a big dish. This is what they call a radio telescope. It's capturing not light from the stars, but radio waves coming from the stars. And it can produce data and images, just like visible. If God wanted us to see radio waves, we could. He just didn't design our eyes to see it. And I had this thought the other day. Remember the story in the Bible about when I think it's Elijah or Elisha was surrounded by the enemies, the Amalekites or whatever, and his servants freaking out because it's hopeless. They're surrounded by the enemy. And Elisha prays that God would open up the servant's eyes. And what does he see? All around the canyon walls, chariots of fire, God's chariots. Angels ready to do the business of the Lord. And talking about electromagnetic energy and the fact that we only see a tiny, tiny spectrum. It would be like having a blanket over my head and I have this tiny little hole that I can look through. And so I see just this. Put your finger up in front of you. I just see that. Everything else is dark. The difference between this and this. We live in a world like this. Little tiny pinpoint hole. That's what it's saying, right? And beyond that, beyond what we detect, what we see, hear, smell, taste, is a gigantic world that we cannot detect. We can develop instruments that shows us that it's out there, but we can't detect it with our body. You see the significance of that, guys? That there is a world out there. Maybe chariots of fire and angels, yes. It's just we don't have the instruments to be able to detect them. And it may be that it only takes just a tiny bit, just a tiny change in the retina of our eye or something that would allow it to expand enough to be able to see the things that we can't see, such as angels. So you say, wow, that's a real miracle. It is a miracle, but everything's a miracle. And it's possible that if God tweaked our eyes or our ears just enough, we could detect things that really exist that we haven't seen before. Yeah, Michael.
So what happened between like theologians that were scientists back in the day and then developing stuff like this to where science is now, way worse off theologically than it was?
Right.
It seems like developing stuff like this would only increase the theological thought behind science.
Sure.
But it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, that's a good question. Throughout the beginning of science, it was seen as an activity that glorified God. And when that transition occurred was in the 19th century, the 1800s. So we began to see that switch. And generally it wasn't till near the end of the 19th century when there began to just be skepticism began to enter science. It's usually correlated with Darwin, the Darwinian view. That's the reason it gets so much attention. But I'm not sure that it really was a scientific thing, personally. I think it was a cultural thing that happened in the culture at large, and it just sort of filtered into science along with everything else. And so scientists became more secularized, but so did everything else in the 19th century. It's a time of uncertainty. They call it the crisis of certainty. The crisis of certainty is what they call it, in which people began to question things. And I don't know. Just to answer your question, there were books written about the story of Christ. There were look for the historical Jesus, things like that. And so it may be that it began by questioning whether Jesus actually lived. I mean, because Christology is the core of Christianity. And so people began to speculate that it was all just a story, the Christ myth. And that began to undermine our belief in Christ and the Bible. But by the end of the 1800s, yes, science had become secularized. It didn't mean scientists necessarily were, but the workings of science were. It's interesting, though, because we're talking about light. And the person who developed the electromagnetic theory of light, what I just talked about, was named James Clerk Maxwell. And he was a very strong Christian. And he even published that the concept for the electrodynamic theory of light actually came from his contemplating the hypostatic union of Christ, which is really fascinating because that means you developed a scientific theory from a theological concept. And so, what is the hypostatic union of Christ? You theologians know? Yeah. He's both God and man at the same time. They overlap. And so, contemplating the hypostatic union of Christ led him to the possibility of two other force fields overlapping, like electricity and magnetism. And so the overlapping of electricity and magnetism to become something totally different, the God-man, light, was actually a theological concept applied to science, which is far beyond what most people think about science. Most people say that theology would actually hinder the development of science, but that's not what the history of science shows. It shows that it's a very fertile field to apply theology to the world. And our theology would express why, right? Why would the natural world reflect theology of the Bible? What's the connection?
God made the natural world.
God made the natural world. God inspired that book we call the Bible, right? Don't we believe that? And so if we believe those two things, should we be surprised that contemplating the hypostatic union of Christ would lead us to an understanding of the world? No, because it was made by the same person. So, they've extended that theory now. With Einstein, they believe that light is actually packets of light called photons. Photons. And that not only behaves as a wave, but it also behaves as a particle. Light is both waves and particles at the same time. Yet waves and particles are two completely different phenomena. Yet light seems to be both at the same time. So it extends. In other words, James Clerk Maxwell contemplates a theological concept, comes up with a theory. This theory miraculously explains all this different phenomenon, and then James Clerk Maxwell dies, they extend his theory, and now Einstein, who's not even a believer, has come up with the idea that it's not just waves, but also particles, which are two totally different kinds of phenomena, and yet they exist, the same, within light. So he's just extended this irrationality that occurs in the hypostatic union. And didn't Jesus say he was the light of the world? So, it's a big mystery. But it's a very beautiful mystery. And as we begin to try to understand the fringes of that mystery, it seems to resonate with what the Bible tells us. At the end of your manuscript, I have a quote from a book called God and the Astronomers by Robert Jastrow. And Robert Jastrow is an avowed agnostic. He's not a Christian. He doesn't even believe in God. Yet he writes this book about God and the astronomers, tracing out the theological development of astronomy and how it becomes secularized. And he ends his book in a very interesting passage, just the very last paragraph of his book. He says that the search for knowledge, I'm paraphrasing here, but the search for knowledge has ended like a bad dream. That as we finally pull ourselves over the last precipice to be able to get a bird's eye view of the world, just as we pull above that last precipice, we look and there's a band of theologians sitting there, and they've been sitting there for thousands of years. So you know what he's saying? In other words, science has finally left God behind and got to the top of the mountain where it can understand what the world is like. And when it gets to the top of the mountain, there's a bunch of theologians sitting there. That's what he's saying, this agnostic saying there's a bunch of theologians sitting there. They've been sitting there because they have some kind of special insight into what the world is like. That's what he's saying, and that's what I'm telling you. It seems like that if we apply our theology to science, it's very fertile in producing these things. Why has science left that? Like I said, I think it's a much larger cultural phenomenon. It's not something that's happened in science itself. It's just a different way of looking at it. Yeah, Michael.
I'm just shocked that they don't, science doesn't understand life, but they seem to be so, there's so much, it's just like a wall, like they would just won't talk about God in any way. You know, they don't understand something as basic as life. Not that it's basic, but that it's everywhere. You know,
Right.
I didn't know that. That's, wow.
Yeah, I think part of the reason scientists don't talk about God is because of the creation-evolution controversy. It's created a very antagonistic environment to where you just get attacked. You got to choose a side. I've been in debates before where I was sort of the moderating position, and it was really tough because whenever I spoke, I would get attacked from both sides. Either that or I was ignored. Either ignored or attacked from both sides. And so it's created sort of a hostile environment where it's very difficult to talk about these types of things. Because on one side you have a new type of science that's based on Scripture, creation science, and on the other side you have a bunch of atheists who are using science to teach atheism. And it's very hard to find common ground.
So they don't have an open mind.
Oh, neither side does, I don't think. They have an agenda, a political agenda.
If you don't have an open mind, how do you explore new ideas?
Well, that's a great point. But these people are not the ones exploring new ideas. They're the ones that are popularizing a particular political agenda that they have. The people who are exploring new ideas are the scientists in the lab coats and the laboratories who are doing science from day to day. And yes, they believe in God by and large and they pray, but that's not something they publicize. They just do that. And that's why I was answering Michael's question is why don't they? I think they probably would if it wasn't such a hostile environment, because as soon as they speak up, they're going to wonder, well, whose side are you on? What camp are you in? And it becomes difficult because you get pulled into the politics of it all. So I think that's part of the equation. And it's sad because there's so much out there that's extremely powerful that could be talked about. And part of it, here's something, I'll probably tell you this several times, but I think it's worthwhile. There's been a lot of attention on miracles and defining miracles as something that's unexplainable. Well, if you define a miracle as something that's unexplainable, then that just pretty much limits God to doing stuff we can't understand in terms of miraculous. And if we can't understand it, it's not God. That's what creates what they call the God of the gap mentality. And it's not biblical at all, is it? Because God can do things we can't understand, just as He can do things we can't understand. And here's the logic I'd like to walk you through to try to help you understand. When God does something, do you think He understands how He did it? Yeah, I'm guessing He probably does. I don't think God does magic, so to speak. Right? God will say, well, wow, how to do that? That's just magic. No. God knows exactly how He does things. Do you think God could build our brain in such a way where He could explain to us how He did it? Yeah, so that means there's nothing that's not potentially understandable, right? So therefore, there's no such thing as a miracle in the context that we normally think of a miracle, right? That's beyond our comprehension. So we can just pretty much throw that out. Just get rid of it. C.S. Lewis does that in his essay called Miracles, where he says that what we call a miracle is just when God decides to do something differently than He normally does. I think that's a very healthy way of looking at it. And so if God still understands how He did it, and He can still explain it to us. But it's not normally how He does it. Therefore, we see it, wow, that's a miracle. But it's just because God worked in a different way, not because it's potentially unexplainable. I think another good part about seeing it that way is it shows us that everything is miraculous, if you just think about it. It's just somehow we become too accustomed to it, to think it's everyday and mundane.